Just an overview. This is not fall. No one caught that last time, including me. I changed the year, but not the semester. That's about right. That's on par for me. So I did do some workshops last fall. It was more on text mining, again, on my website. Feel free to check those out. But this semester, we're focusing on analyzing qualitative data. So a couple weeks ago, we did data cleaning. Today, we are doing data preparation and qualitative coding. And then at the end of March, we're doing qualitative analyses. Now, for anybody who's actually done any of these, you're like, how am I supposed to get all this done in an hour? Yeah, that's not happening, right? So this is really just an introduction. If you watched the previous video, I showed you some data and a project that I'm currently working on. These really are kind of geared towards that project and for my students, but I want to open it up as I've gotten a lot of requests for help on qualitative projects. And as you know, it's held in conjunction with the class that you're currently in. So just as an overview, again, this is just repeating what we did last time. The goals are to debunk myths about qualitative research, which I went over a lot in the first video, to discuss the systematic procedures. One of the biggest issues I have is that people think that qualitative is just like loosey-goosey and go in there and do some things, and it's not. It needs to be systematic. And then some reflection and application to your own work and your own interests. And so the structure is a presentation on the topic, guided practice with example data from one of my current projects. And then I'll answer questions either general or specific to your projects. So some data preparation considerations. The first thing is like, okay, so we talked last time that data is cleaned, hopefully. The metaphor that I gave last time was comparing it to dirty dishes, how you expect, these nice clean dishes, but what you get is like gross. Well, sure enough, how many of you have ever like gone to your cupboard, got out a cup, and it's like, this isn't really clean? That happened to me last week with my data, where it said the scenario didn't match, the responses didn't match with the prompt, and there were some numbers confused. So sometimes you think it's clean and it's still not. So continuing to iterate and make notes of that. So making sure your data is clean. And I cannot emphasize this enough. I will always, this is like one of my many soapboxes of the importance of a theoretical framework. Even if you're using grounded theory, there still needs to be some like big T theoretical framework that's guiding you in what you're looking at, why you're looking at it, how you interpret it, how do you make sense of it. There should be this kind of overarching theoretical framework, or more than one, depending on the questions. And then having some sort of initial coding scheme. So as I'm sure y'all know, there's different kinds of ways to code. So one is inductive, where a researcher reads and interprets raw data to develop concepts, themes, and models. This is, you're not starting with any particular codes and you're developing them as you go. Deductive, those are codes that are predefined and set up before applying them to data. So also known as a priori. And then mixed, which is my particular go-to, is where you begin with a priori codes and allowing additions to be systematically added during coding. That doesn't mean at the end you're like, oh, here's a new code, and then don't go back and recode all the things. And so I think this is one of the reasons I do mixed coding schemes, is because my area of research is fairly new. Some of the ones that are more established, it's like, nope, these are all the codes you're going to see. You shouldn't see anything else. There shouldn't be anything to add. Of course, I also don't believe that. So thinking about that, and then how you want to do that. And again, but all those, again, should be based on theory. And then some enhancing trustworthiness. Anytime I talk about,
I'm really sorry, is the PowerPoint on your?
It's not on there yet. No. I'll put it up there. So yes. Sorry. No. Yeah. So I'll put the, because I'm always going to find mistakes, like the fall. But I will put it up on my website. Yes. So sorry about that. And so I would be remiss if I don't talk about enhancing trustworthiness when I talk about qualitative. which is, triangulating data from different sources, the reflexivity, acknowledging your role, striving for balance and fairness, documenting your analysis procedures, and being upfront about your own personal biases, seeking of exceptions and contradictory evidence, spending considerable time on site, which we did not do because mine's online, and member checking. So, I do a lot of stuff with emotions, and it's really gross to be like, this is what they were feeling. What was it? Ask them, this is what we interpreted. Do you agree? And audit trails, and then peer debriefing. And so having other experts look at your findings and your analysis and see if they agree or disagree. So for this project, and again, I'll go over it in a little bit. So this project, and I swear that I'm not a narcissist, but I use my own model. So the Freckle model is the formation of regulation for emotions the formation and regulation of emotions in collaborative learning. It is here, it is a lot. And the citation is here if you would like to look into it. And then I also documented the coding procedure in Frontiers. That one is open access. So I basically kind of walk through what I'm going to be walking through today of like step 1, this is what I would do. Step 2, this is what you do. And then considerations for coding this. Because again, if you can't tell from that model, it's a smidge complex, just a smidge. Can the people online still see my screen? I don't see the green line around it, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we can.
Perfect, thank you. So one thing I see interchangeably, and this is, I don't know if there's a right and a wrong, what is the difference between a code book and a coding scheme, but I'm going to tell you how I think of it. To me, a coding scheme is a list of codes. A code book has more details. Call it whatever you want, but it has, and we're going to talk about this, it has it has the list of codes, it has the organization of codes, it has definitions, examples, my favorite non-examples, commonly confused with other codes. And then probably the most important thing that you just never see in code books for some reason are actual procedures and this is really important when you are, for example, using software and you're calculating inter-rater reliability, and one person highlights the whole sentence and another person highlights just a word. And even though they have the same code, it says that there's a disagreement in how they highlighted. So there's just little procedures of, okay, we're gonna do all this first, or this is how we do it, just to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page and just clearly documented. And that one's just left out, including mine. I'm still working on it. So for this particular theoretical framework, step 1 is adding context, which we're going to talk about. Step 2 is measuring emotional expressions, which is actually down at the bottom. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer this, but I'll save you the details if you're not interested in emotions and collaborative learning. Identifying stimulus events, recognizing appraisals, and then capturing regulation. So there's a lot of different coding. And so again, in my paper, I clearly document how to do this. Here, I'm just going to provide a quick overview. So again, just some background, I'm going to skip real quick. The data, and again, I mentioned this in the last video, is that we created 59 scenarios and we recruited through Prolific. So we have people from all over the world. Each survey, we divided the 59 into 12 surveys. Each one had 12 college students at different levels. There were some duplicates. Some people took different versions, which was fine. And then we got general demographics through Prolific. And then we actually collected the data through Qualtrics with open-ended responses, and then some specific demographics, but no identifiable data. And then we're going to do a thematic analysis. So basically, we gave them a scenario that says, how would you respond to this very typical challenge working in groups? And then they responded with at least 15 words. So last video, we talked about how to clean that. And it won't let me. You can see, sorry, I've got multiple screens. That data kind of look like this. So it's incredibly de-identified because I just made up a bunch of stuff. So you can see for the first form, there were 20, so for these 5, there were 20 people that answered these 5, and then 20 people that answered the 5 on the next version, and so on. So this is what it looked like when I was cleaning it. I did a control find. I know it's nonsense. That's why I'm sharing. I'm not going to share real data. Come on, yeah. So then, are you ready? Is everyone mentally, emotionally? I can help you if you're not emotionally ready. Yeah.
In that Excel, like each cell, like the text, like kind of not real. Is like you like have to do it in a way that you need to refer back to the.
So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. That's just the overview. And again, that was cleaned, but it's not sorted. So we will talk about that today. If you still have that question at the end, circle back and I'll go back over it. All right, deep breath in, deep breath out. Most people have cleaned it and they're like, let's code, let's do this. I'm going to suggest instead that there are general strategies for preparing qualitative data. So yes, you can respond. This is what I expect. So when I said there was a systematic way, I wasn't kidding. Again, this will be on my website. You do not have to copy all these, and we're going to walk through every single one. But I feel like a lot of people love to skip over some of these, and qualitative sometimes gets a bad rap of like, oh, it's not rigorous. What about this? Says not rigorous, right? So again, you're going to hear me say it. You're going to get tired of me saying it. This is what I call getting out in front of the haters, right? Stopping them before they like, well, did you do this? Or I don't know. We're going to do all these things and we're going to document all these things. So at the end, you're going to be like, wow, look how systematic they were. All right, so before I dive in, and again, we're going to go over every single one. So the first 2 we're going to do in the first hour, and then the second 2 we'll do in the second hour. But again, I think data preparation is over all of them. But before we dive in, are there any general questions about the context, about what it is we're trying to do? Yes.
So just to make sure I'm like totally getting this.
And if you're not,
Yeah,
that's
good.
probably where you should be. Okay. Okay.
The idea here is that let's say I'm doing a bunch of interviews and I've recorded all this and I'm trying to now make meaning and to see if there's any kind of overarching analysis I can do. This is kind of gonna, this is what I'm walking through.
Yeah, so great question. So, and I know that, so it's one of those like, it's my workshop, I'm gonna do what I want. So I'm gonna use my data, but it's very different than I think most people, most people have interviews. My dissertation was all transcripts from collaborative learning. So the data can look different. What this is, so kind of what you were mentioning with the making sense of it is the coding. That's gonna come next. In this next, however long I have left in this first hour, it's really going to be about preparing the data. Let's make this process as seamless as possible. Because that's what happens, is that we get excited for data. I've got one project that somebody take my survey. And so you're just excited and you're ready to go. But there's some preparation that needs to happen before we just dive on in. So that's exactly what we're there. And this is the one that everyone hates because you're ready. You want to know about coding. I know that. But you're stuck listening to me talk about this for now. Okay, so any other questions? Let's try that again. All right, so we're going to start with step 1, preparing the data for coding. So the first one, and I apologize, you can't see that, it says that we're going to convert the data into one or more forms that will be easy to organize. This is what we talked about in the video last week, right? So we're going to convert the data, we're going to clean the data. Does it make sense to put in Word? Does it make sense to put in Excel? we're gonna put it in a form that makes it easier. I know that a lot of this should depend on your software or how you plan on coding it. It's really hard sometimes when you put like tables in NVivo, it gets mad at you. Sometimes when you code in Word, for those of you that want to quantify your beautiful qualitative codes, you probably want to use Excel. So these are kind of things to think about. But to organize them, if you have interview data, the thought of putting that in Excel will be my nightmare for tonight. So you have to make sense and kind of figure out what's best for you. And then there's this idea of running records, which I talk a lot about in my paper. This also goes with step 1 of my procedure. Running records is about adding context to the data, because most of the data, so for the data here, it's what they typed in, so I don't really have a lot of context. But most transcriptions are what they say. I study students learning in collaborative learning groups. It's very important that I add in notes for what they're doing, which has to be done systematically. So I can't just be like, oh, look, all of a sudden on my next to last transcript, they're waving their hands. I should put that in there. This is something that from the beginning, you're like, I do emotion. So if somebody is like laughing or nodding their head or crying, that's something that might not have been picked up on the transcript, especially if you're like me and you pay other people to do it, especially with collaborative learning. It's really important to go back in and add in that context that you might want to code, right? Most of you are students. And so even if if you have video data or audio data, identifiable data that kind of belongs to your university and you lose access to it, the de-identified data, assuming you can still get access to it, the more context you have in there, the better you'll remember it and the better it will be. Sorry.
I'm really sorry, I'm just not quite clear, when would you use Excel for?
So I use Excel for mine. I use Excel for open-ended survey responses. So then each row is one person. I also have used Excel for transcripts with talk turns with groups. So it's like row 1 is me talking, row 2 is you talking, row 3 is her talking. And so it depends on what and how. This is definitely a question of, or the answer is, it depends. The other thing too is I know I usually love to use MaxQDA. It's very expensive. The school doesn't, to my knowledge, have a free software for qualitative yet. And so for example, if you get NVivo and NVivo is like, we don't take Excel, we don't take Excel, then you wouldn't want to do Excel. Right.
Using NVivo, I've done interviews
Yeah.
before, but yeah, I was just trying to wrap my head around
Right.
that.
So Excel is one that's easy to code in and it's free and everyone has. It's really great for deductive coding. Yeah, and I'll show you that. Yeah, great question. So the next is suspense. Okay. Again, it's important to consider your coding procedures when you're making these, of like who is doing what software are you using, etc. Because you don't want to have to go, we're on one project where everything was done in Word and now we want to quantify it, and going back is painful. So not impossible, but painful. And so then again, we're just going to ground everything in the press data that was the survey that we created. Is we chose Excel because each row is a participant. So if, going back to that data, sorry, I have to, other way. So each data is a participant. So participant 1, these are their 5 responses. So each column is a question, a scenario. So version 1, scenario 5, and then participant 1 answered these 5. Let's see if this one has it. Yeah. Okay. You can do it. Come on. All right. So then The next thing is to organize the data in a preliminary, superficial way that's easy to understand. And so this is kind of still in that data cleaning, but kind of cleaning plus. The cleaning is really just like, it's in Prolific, it's in a transcript that I've either done myself or used AI or paid someone to do, and you're cleaning it, you're removing identifiable. But organizing the data is really about structuring it in a more purposeful way for what you're going to be doing with it. So you need to think about what metrics matter. So time, demographics, categories, and how they'll be arranged. So for example, my dissertation, we had 3 groups and multiple time points. So those were each their own document. Makes sense. I don't want to put all of them together, right? Other times when you're doing focus groups, things like that, where you have multiple people talking, you want to think about how do you want to organize this by person? Do you want to organize it by topic? So you just want to think about the data and making sure like it flows, right? So on a Word document, I might put, depending on how my focus group went, I might have asked a question, everyone responded, and then we went on to the next one. So maybe I separate those in Word on different pages, or maybe in Excel, I put them on different tabs because I'm going to use different codes for those. Okay. And then maybe I want to put, let's say I did 10 focus groups. Maybe I want to put all of the focus groups response to question 1 on the same tab because they're going to get all the same codes. So even though they didn't happen in the same focus group, so again, you just have to think about this and be able to justify your decisions. And so then for the press, what we did was the scenarios were created, and those are the stimulus events for those who are obsessed with my model, so just me. As we did task-related scenarios, non-task, and then social. And so the first thing I did after, I hate to keep going back and forth, I do apologize, is I color-coded, this was on the actual document, that I think green was task, yellow was non-task, and blue was social. So then I created the social, and then I pulled out, let me see if it's, and I created this form. So see how I'm not doing anything yet. I'm still just kind of cleaning. And I basically did version 1, and then, so this is the scenario, version 1, scenario 5. And I put all the responses, ignore the yellow, all the responses, and then the gray one. So this in gray is the actual scenario so that I can make sense of my responses side by side. And so then you go down, because over here is where I'm going to put the codes, which I'll show you. And so here there were 18 social codes. So this, it goes to like 300 and some. Yeah. But I needed them all. I'm going to code using the same system. So I needed them all in the same row. I needed to be clearly mark which one is which, or else I'd have 1,000 tabs. And that's not the way I like to do things. Feel free. Again, this is about making your own and just being very clear. So sorry about that. So then the next one is to identify preliminary categories and divide data into meaningful units that can help with coding. Ignore that, that's supposed to pop up later. Identify meaningful categories. So you want to look for subcategories that will help you break up the data in a meaningful way. So this is to help you see patterns and answer research questions. Depending on how, your category, they might already be in all the categories, right? It depends on how complex your data is, on how many times you do this. I make my life harder than it needs to be, right? Yeah.
So identify categories at this stage, but have you started coding them?
We're not even close to coding. I tell you. So the question was, are we close? Are we coding yet? Not even close. Because, and then hopefully you'll see why. Hopefully you're like, she's doing too much. And one day you're gonna be doing this yourself and you're like, that crazy lady with the sparkly shirt, she was on to something. And I'm gonna be like, yeah, I know. because I'll be right behind you. No, I don't know. So the reason we're doing this is because this is like a worst case. This is very messy data with a lot of different things. Some of it, organized data, you're done. I'll show you what I mean here. And the reason is because I have a very elaborate coding scheme. I'm not going to put my model back up there because you'll see. And the more things you're trying to code at once to different things, it gets messy, inter-rater goes way down, it becomes unreliable. So this is, again, about that systematic, we're going to do this and all of these together. It'll also really help you see patterns. So this is about chunking it into smaller sections. So for example, going back to my focus group example, maybe I want to chunk by specific focus group because of how they were building on top of each other. Maybe I'm interviewing teachers and I want to group my elementary teachers separately from my high school teachers because my research questions had something to do with that. Yes.
So what you're saying makes sense because it's still related to your categories of people you chose. You already know it. What about like doing deductive coding, like deductive categories? Does that also apply in this stage?
Again, I think, so the question was, does this also relevant for deductive coding? Mine is deductive. Very rarely do I do just inductive. And that's a whole nother ball of wax. Again, I think, some of you will hate me for this, but in the long run, it's really just about messy data. I think everyone thinks that their data is going to be nice and clean, and it's really hard for me to get up here and anybody to say, here's how you find patterns. Like, how do you teach, right? Like, how do you teach someone to see patterns? It's something I've struggled with my whole life. I used to teach math and had to teach logic and reasoning and proofs. It's very difficult. Yes, that face of the horror. But what this does is, what I'm hoping to help you with is by structuring it in a way so that the patterns will just hopefully pop out at you. Hopefully, in a perfect world. So let me show you what that looks like here. So in the press data, if you remember, I had task, non-task, and social. But within those, I had subcategories. And so, for example, task-related challenges is I don't understand it. Everyone else in the group is ready to move on to the next stage, and I don't understand it. What should I do? Social is more like somebody can't do their part because they have a medical emergency, or somebody is taking over and doing everything and won't stop talking, those things. So within the social, there are 3 more categories. And so again, my question is my research question that I didn't repeat, so now's a good time, is looking at how people respond to these challenges differently. And so how people respond to communication problems, interaction problems, and relation problems are probably going to be more similar than how they respond to task problems. But I think they're going to be separate enough so that I can look at each one and wrap my head around, and then I can start to compare and see where these differences are and start to make some hypotheses or some notes about why I think these differences exist and why people handle different situations differently. Again, this is worst case. You can ask the people that work in my lab. This is worse. The few of you that didn't laugh, but that's fine. They're crying. So let me show you real quick what this looks like. So here's all my original data. Then I pulled out the social situations, which again, there was 18 of them. And then I pulled out just the communication. So we're going to talk about that in a second. Ignore. Those are my codes. Spoiler. And so here are just the 6 maybe that were communication. And I'm only going to do the first 20%. Again, spoiler. So now I can look at just these kind of together. And so these are all different types of communication. But then within communication, there's an avoiding confrontation scenario. There's people who just criticize without giving actual good feedback, just giving feedback in general. All those are the only 3 I copied. And see, now I can start to make patterns in pieces. Because I think what happens is most times everyone wants to look at the whole thing and make patterns. So you want to dive in, and it's harder to see those patterns. Yes?
So at this stage, the meaningful categories are more structural ways of looking at the data, because when I see meaningful, I start thinking themes and that sort of thing.
So what do I mean by meaningful? I mean, yes, you're still thinking of structure, and meaningful is defined by 2 things that should be very close: your theoretical framework and your research questions. So my theoretical framework, the reason, like the Freckle model in the stimulus events, splits it into 3 different clear sections. Then within each one, there are clear sections. It lined up because literally we use that to make the scenarios, so that helps. But you know, so again, it depends on the data. You know, it's really hard, but I'm loving the reflection and to think about how this kind of works for your own thing, because nobody's will look the exact same, which makes this both exciting and difficult. And then the last step in this stage, again, that's when that last red thing was supposed to pop up, is to finalize your initial code book. So you want to confirm your initial coding scheme, procedures, and coder understanding. So now that you've organized it, did the coding scheme still make sense? Am I missing anything? Do I want to apply all the codes to every single one? You know, these are where you come up with your initial set of rules for coding and how to code it. And so for us, what we did was, an example is to create drop-down lists in Excel. So in Excel, you've got the non-real example. There's going to be a tab that says keys in the code book. There's going to be a data validation tab of like, for this category, here are all the possible codes. And then I think some of them have it on there. Again, oops. You can see there's a drop down. These were the possible options. And that other, we'll talk about that. That's my inductive coding. And then none, some of them did not include a strategy, so there was no target, which we did not have at first, but we'll get there. So that's how we did it. The other one, if you're using NVivo or MaxQDA or something like that, finalizing your initial code book is building out all of the codes and et cetera in the system. Again, just having a clear plan, sharing the file, all that kind of stuff. Questions here? Lots of information, I know. Yes?
In here, the category preliminary at this stage, like you're trying to make common categories from theoretical framework and research questions. At least category right now is preliminary, and they will probably not be the same, right? They will have to start the coding and analysis.
Great question. So the question was, are these categories preliminary? And they are really categories. Don't think of them as themes yet, right? So they're categories. And like I said, you might skip this meaningful categories. Your data might already be organized as it needs to be. The messier it is, you might have to keep going with those subcategories. And so I would say that they're preliminary in that, and this happened for us, the data, when we got done with our first initial, which we're going to talk about next, it was like, something's wrong. We need to, so originally we didn't have the communication, and it was just a mess. And that's when we went back and it was an iterative process. So we were like, oh no, we should, so our first, and I say we, it was me, it was a mess. It was a mess. I should have done this before. Anyway, so we just did it by social, and then they all kind of ran together, and the iterator was not great. And it was just, and I was like, we need to take it a step further. So then we had to go back. So in that situation, you hope it's not preliminary, that it is the one you want, so you don't have to go back. But it's 100% you could, because the last thing you want to do is say, good enough. And then you go, and then your inter-rater reliability is like a 20%, and then it will never get accepted in a million years. And I mean, more than just, that's gross, but more than just that, like it's not reliably coded. But anyway, yes.
So in the dropdown in Excel, so this is one of the, this were our options for the codes to apply. How do you know the options already?
So that's my code book. So my code book, again, I'm assuming that most of you have not read my Freckle. Why would you? It's a joke. Why would you? In the domain, or sorry, in the target, the model has 4 options. Yeah. Now again, so this is where my model came out a few years ago. I'm pretty sure it's just those 4, but I'm always like, to me, that's one of the big findings is, because at the end of the day, your research should do one of 3 things. It should confirm previous research, at least one of 3 things. Confirm previous research, expand previous research, or contradict previous research. And that's how I like to think about, like, for the discussion, when I'm setting up my discussion. So here, it might extend it. It might, I don't think so, but I like to put it there just in case. Because adding codes later when you're doing this is harder. Yeah. And so I do an other, I'm gonna talk about the other as a catch-all. Yeah. All right, so then let's not have to do all those again. Any other questions? I think we're pretty good on time. Okay, so we're still not ready to code, but we're almost there. We're going to be practice coding. So applying the initial coding scheme to a subset of data. Notice how I didn't call it coding, because I know y'all wanted to do that. I also forgot to mention, so this original picture with all of these, I used it in a couple of years ago in a class when I was teaching qualitative methods online for a friend of mine. I think I made it, but I'm not sure. So if you see it somewhere, and I really looked hard, I think I made it, but I'm not sure. At the end, I do give you some references to look at, but if you see it somewhere else, please let me know, because it definitely needs to be given the credit, but I can't remember where I got it. Maybe, I don't know. So I do apologize for that. Okay, applying the initial coding scheme. So this is where you are going to start practicing coding with data that you won't be using in the analysis. So data that you've collected that you don't want to use. What if you don't have one? So here's an example. In my dissertation, we collected data from 6 groups. Then we did a representative case sample where we chose 3 groups. So then we had 3 other groups to practice on. What if you don't have one? So if you are planning on using this for analysis, then you should report the IRR, which at the beginning, the inter-rater reliability is going to be bad, unless the codes are sometimes the codes are just like really clear. Not anything that I work on, because that's how my brain works. So what if you don't have one? Any ideas on what you could do? Yeah?
Language models like ChatGPT, put them on a research setting and get them, tell them to give you a bunch of different examples.
That's much better than what I did, yes. So he said you could use ChatGPT to create new data, which for my data makes sense. Could ChatGPT say, I had an interview with the teacher, and it could, how good would it be? I don't know. But you also have to think about it. You really want this practice coding to be representative. And so let's say I had, so when we practiced on that one group, I didn't just do one time point. I did beginning and end, right? Because they're going to be talking about different things. So if I only do one teacher, I'm like, we got this. But then another teacher talks about completely different things. So it's tricky. This part is really, really tricky. So you want this practice to be a representative sample. I do like that of like, let's see what ChatGPT will give us so because we don't want to, our precious data, we don't want to not be able to use it. And then we also don't want it in this calibration phase to just pull down our iterator, which it likely will. Yes.
Are there like data sets? I feel like there's data sets somewhere that you can practice on.
Good question. So the question was like, are there available data sets out there? Yes. But coding to me is so context specific that, so even now, like one of the things we struggled with is my coding framework was developed for observational protocols of students doing collaborative learning. So now applying it to this very slightly different context, we still found issues of like, well, they're not really talking. Like there's certain things that we're like, well, we're not going to code for that because it was kind of made that way, you know? So this is where it gets tricky. So what did we do? We created fake ones. So I purposely made ones that I knew would run the gamut of all the different things we needed. And again, I'm not coding by myself. There's 2 coders. And so when I was training my team, very poorly, but we're getting better. I'm getting better. So I created fake ones that kind of would do a bunch of things, and it was okay in some ways and not okay in others. It's always nice to have an extra data set that you don't need, but it is rare. Yeah.
How many do you need to practice generally?
Again, I think it's about the representative sample. So for us, it was like, and we didn't do the whole thing, right? So it's about getting comfortable, and there's a way that you can test that IRR, which I'm going to talk about is, you know, so if you did 1 and then you had a really high, you're ready. If you did 1 and you didn't. The problem is, again, if they're talking, like, for example, the focus group, if you only coded the first question, and then the 4th question is very different, which would have different codes that are harder to, you know, because some codes are really easy, like my none codes. They're not doing any of that, you know, versus other ones that's like, is it this or this, that requires a little bit more inference. So you want to be and document everything and representative. But this is such an important step. And I think what happens from personal experience is that you just want to get started and you want to dive in, that you're like, yep, good enough, let's go. And then those first iterators are really low and you're hoping for a good average to pull them up.
Just a quick other question. Are you not allowed to like take, I don't know, randomly pull things from the real data that you will use that as a practice?
Again, so this is where you kind of have to document everything. Are you allowed to do it? Right. Will your dissertation committee fail you because you don't know. So again, I think there's the in a perfect world, and sometimes it's more perfect than others. But I don't know, and I'm sure you can look and there's other people who have better examples, and but this is the hardest part, is what do you practice on? Because I'm gonna, yeah.
I'm just wondering about like creating fake responses in the context of an interview study, perhaps. Would you like do a fake interview with your colleague, like asking them to imagine your population? Like how would that work?
Or you could do one with, I mean, ChatGPT will do more things than you think, so that would be where I first start. You could also do an interview with like someone in your lab, someone that's not real data, like a partner, a friend, you know. Again, I don't know how authentic it would be. I mean, there's best case, and then you kind of just work your way. And then worst case really is just using your actual data. So there was a question over here.
Yeah, what's the problem they will have if you use your possible real data to do that?
So any data that you use, like, so your real data, you have to report that inter-rater reliability in your final inter-rater reliability. And so if you're training on the data that you're going to use, it's gonna be bad probably. And so then you start really low, which is why this whole stage is about working out all the kinks and making sure everyone's on the same page. And if you do that with your real data, then you're gonna reconcile, so it's gonna be fine, but your inter-rater reliability that you have to report doesn't really represent where you're ending. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is the hardest part. Let me move on because I want to make sure I finish. So the step 2 is consider using 2 or more raters to independently code. This is the standard. You code separately, add the notes, and then check the inter-rater reliability and reconcile. I'm not going to talk about inter-rater. There's tons of ways to do it. I will save that for Jessica. She gets the fun conversation. I'm out. But then reconciling to 100% is the key. Now, I've heard some people argue that it doesn't even matter what your inter-rater reliability is, because as long as you reconcile to agreement. I don't 100% agree with that. I see their point, because at the end of the day, the coding scheme does need to be reliable, but that reconciliation is the most important piece. So what we do in Excel is that we put one person's and then another person's, and then we use this feature that says equal exact and say, does this one equal this one? And it'll say true if it does, and then it'll say false. And so then all the false ones are discrepancies. But I will say you really, in this case, need to look at all of them. Just because you agreed on something doesn't mean that it's actually the best. Especially what I do when I'm coding is I highlight the ones I'm not sure about in yellow or some color to make sure that we talk about them. So I might have put it in yellow because I wasn't sure, and Jessica put it in yellow because she wasn't sure, just because, and they were matching, but that doesn't mean that like we're on the same page. We still need to discuss that and work through it, okay? One of the big things is 2 or more. This is something that we did. There is too much of splitting there. When you're dividing it up, it's possible to have different people code different things, but it's much harder to see those patterns across all of them when you're dividing it up. So just keep that in mind. So then the big one is so in this stage, what you are trying to do, the main goal is to clarify, co-construct meaning, rules, note issues, and aim for that higher rater or higher inter-rater reliability. This is about getting on the same page. So discussing the coding, the notes with the coders, and adding to the code book. So that means including and updating descriptions. This is where you put examples in, non-examples of 2 things that kind of get confused. It's like when they say this, it's this, not this. This is, I cannot emphasize this enough. This is when you're like, oh no, I probably should have broken that down, or I probably should have combined them. I didn't need to split it into 4 different levels, right? I could have just had one and whatever. This is where you're building, you're co-constructing the code book. And so for us, one of the things we did is we realized that what we really needed to do was color code different parts of the responses. So this green part is when they were talking about their appraisals, how they were interpreting what was happening in the scenario. And then the orange part was the actual strategy that they're using. So by color coding this, it helped us focus, okay, so no green, none, no green, none. Like this green, and then I didn't put the drop down in there. So it helps to kind of break it apart. So the color coding is what we decided that we really needed to do, because there was confusion about, well, some people thought it was this, some people thought it was this. So the first step is deciding which area it goes into, and then from there, which of the codes for that area. And then the last one is finalizing the code book. So this could be you've gone through and you're done, hooray. It could be iterative, you could go all the way back to the beginning, which we did. But this is about determining the procedures and plans for coding and updating as needed. So again, if I'm doing Excel, I want to update my drop-down lists. I think originally I didn't have a none, and you have to hit something. Color code together first. The other thing, and I forgot to mention this, I don't know how, one of the biggest procedures is how much am I coding? Because there are some people that code every single line, especially if it's in Word. Now, if it's in Excel, you know, you're going to do one code per row, whatever that is. But in Word, it's like, does this get a code? Is it 2 codes? Can I have 4 codes? Am I coding the sentence? And so those are, I see some people that code like literally every sentence. I have other people who are like, well, this sentence has 2 parts. And so having that conversation is really important of how much coding is appropriate, the scope of the coding. Yes.
So just so I'm clear, so are all these steps that we just described at the stage still with the practice data?
Yes. So the first step is to clean your data. Then you're going to,
There's like these 4 steps,
Yeah.
like the independently coding, the
Yeah.
constructing
this is,
understanding.
the calibration phase is about getting on the same page.
Okay,
So once you're on the same page, then you go to the real data,
right, okay.
assuming you have, right.
What have you found works best for coding procedures? Like, yeah, but
No.
yeah, for like full sentence, because I mean, I've been caught into that where it's like
Yeah.
sometimes 2, 3 different things. Do I do just the word? Do I do the sentence up till that point?
So the question is, like, what do you find is the best to do? Sentence, and you're gonna get the most Nikki/qualitative response. It depends. I think, again, it depends on the constructs. It depends on the codes. It depends on my research questions. You know, it depends on what my data looks like, because this data is very different than what so for example, this data, I'm coding each row independently. For my dissertation data, where it's collaborative learning and their talk turns bouncing back and forth, I didn't code just one. I coded episodes that went across interactions. So I'd say something, then you'd say something. And so the first step is actually to do episodic coding. I thought it'd be too much for here. But that's in my paper if you want to read about that. So is it about what and an interview is tough because it's like one person can ramble on, and they do, sorry, that's what you want them to do. Hopefully they ramble on. It's like, where do I put a break here? And again, that's why every decision that you make is justified by theory, by the context, right? So you might see where they're switching their story to past and future. You know, so again, that kind of goes back to that organization of like, how does that make sense?
Probably also depends on how it was transcribed. Like someone might put a period somewhere, someone else might not.
Well, and so I will say too, you all should be coding the exact same version. So this is a perfect time. You know, I get mine from an online source and it'll say inaudible. And when I listen to it, I'm like, they clearly said this, you know. This is where you also kind of work out those kinks. And so then you have a final version that we're coding this one. And there's also too, like I struggle with inter-rater reliability, which is why, you know, of this, you're going to say, oh, there's a discrepancy here. You know, there are people that do more simple agreement, but I've also, including myself, but I've also gotten a lot of pushback for that. But again, you have to make your argument and those kind of things. So IRR can be measured in multiple ways, and simple agreement is one of the reliabilities. So simple agreement is like, well, this is the simplest way you had this many codes and we agreed on this many of them. But you see how it's not as specific, it kind of combines things that shouldn't. So, but again, you just have to justify and document everything. Because there was one where the reviewer was like, no simple coding. And I was like, well, that's all the information we have. Like in order to do something like, was it Krippendorf's alpha or something like that with the different categories, we would have had to take much more detailed notes and document our process very differently, which Excel is really great for that. But again, most of the softwares, it's just like, tell me my number. But again, their number, it's flawed. So yeah, all right. So now we're calibrated, we're ready to go. let's talk about coding. Just kidding, we're gonna take a break. So to be continued. So real quick, let's talk about, so what are some challenges? Again, when is the calibration done? So again, most inter-rater, I'm not gonna get into it. 70 is like the minimum, 70%, 80 is like the gold standard. If you're higher than 80, let's go. But again, I think it's about the repercussions of moving on too quickly, right? And again, this is assuming you have a double coder. I know for like dissertations, sometimes you don't, especially inductive coding. How can you have agreement on inductive codes if you think about it? So I really am talking more about deductive coding here. But the calibration, I still would practice on like a subset of data, even if you're kind of working it by yourself. So how do you, I get this question, how do you determine who is right? And I think that's a huge issue of like, let's move past right and wrong, because it's about co-constructing meaning and explaining interpretations, etc. So that's a trick question. And then the challenges of like mine, when you're using a complex code book, there is that temptation to code everything at once, all at once, so that you can keep moving forward. But it's going to be much more reliable to code for part one, part two, instead of part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to be way more reliable and mentally better. I think that's, yeah. Questions? We have a couple minutes before we take a break. Yeah.
So does the rigor, in your opinion, go down when you're doing inductive coding? Because it seems to me that a lot of the steps that you just articulated don't, like you can't, do that sort of testing and confirming reliability and those sorts of things.
Great question. So in my opinion, was the key part of that I'm going to answer. Does the rigor go down with inductive coding? No, but I'm a pro qualitative. So there's that. I do think that sometimes for others it will, but there are other ways to increase the rigor, and that's that trustworthiness. And so if you don't have the reliability scale, then you do the triangulation or like those kind of things, peer debriefing. And so if you don't have, and again, I think it's funny to me because if you have a dissertation committee, you have peer debriefers, right? They're reading it and saying, oh, this is what they did. Does it make sense? So, and there's also an auditor option, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But there are ways to, and I think even for your own mental health of like, does this make sense? Like, I've just been staring at this for hours and days. Like, am I on the right path? But the key is documenting everything. It makes me laugh in a hateful way when people talk about how easy qualitative is or how like it's not rigorous. And it's not that it's not, it's that people stop the rigorous at doing the methods and not writing about the methods. Because if you really document every single thing that you did, you're like, oh, wow, I did a lot. And again, then there's only certain places that you can publish because qualitative papers are very long and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there are different things with inductive. And I think a lot of pushback is anytime you have one coder, that's why you have to, that reflexive of like, here are my personal biases, member checking, because there's times when one coder makes sense. Deductive, it's a bit harder to make that case, just because the field and the standards and the norms and those kind of things. So you just need to be prepared for that. So we're going to take a break. So this is for everyone online. I'm actually going to quit Zoom so I can save this video. And then I will bring Zoom back up around 4. So we're going to take 10 minutes and then finally get into the coding, which I don't know why. It's the worst part. No, it's not. I love coding. All right. So we'll see everyone back here in 10 minutes around 4 o'clock.
So if I could just make a brief announcement to the class in person, on my courses, in the qualitative resources folder, you will find